Max Verstappen has been at the center of attention with his latest antics in Mexico and Austin. And while in Texas he was able to respect the guidelines and race Norris hard, forcing him to commit an overtake outside of the circuit and then be penalized for it, the narrative has changed for Mexico. With the stewards that handed Verstappen the two 10-second penalties speaking out about whether or not Verstappen's racing style would change, it will be very interesting to see how the FIA and the rest of the stewards will act if they see similar actions from the three-time world champion. But will they adjust to this and accept it as hard racing, or will Max be made an example for the remainder of the grid to know what's good and what's not in terms of racing maneuvers? It's safe to say that Max Verstappen has been showing his elbows out quite hard in the last two races, which was obviously needed given the fact that the RB20 lost its superiority and they're now the third fastest car on many occasions. Even in the Constructors' Championship, the Austrian team lost the lead to both McLaren and Ferrari, and are now standing in a difficult situation with a lot of pressure on their shoulders to improve. Be that as it may, the Drivers' Championship is another story, and with a 47-point lead headed into the last four events, with two sprint races included, the steward from Mexico, Johnny Herbert, does not expect that the three-time world champion will change the way he races. Elaborating further on this matter, the former F1 driver, who had some words to exchange with Verstappen regarding the swearing saga in the press conference, went on to say, "The penalties in Mexico won't stop Max Verstappen from pushing Lando Norris off the track in the future. The whole intention of Verstappen was to try to let the Ferrari get the 1-2 finish. I think that's definitely what Verstappen intended and tried to achieve. I understand why he did it, but I don't agree with it. I don't think many people do. Fair racing is something Norris has mentioned before, and that's the type of fight he wants to have. I don't see Verstappen's driving changing, because the number one goal is to stop Norris from closing the gap for the Drivers' Championship. We potentially still have a lot of interesting racing coming our way." What Herbert said is not far from the truth, because even Verstappen himself said that if he didn't do what he did in Turn 8, Norris would have very likely won the race because he would have been P2 behind Sainz in that sequence of events and would have had the pace to get past him as he did against Leclerc. Be that as it may, this will definitely pose a serious threat to the FIA to be as objective as possible, because there's no doubt that we might be looking at a lot more 10-second penalties for the behaviour of the Dutchman on the track. Even Christian Horner believes that the racing of Verstappen won't change in the foreseeable future, something that Jos Verstappen has agreed with, and when talking about it to a greater extent, the team principal of Red Bull went on to say, "Max will always drive aggressively to what he perceives as the regulations. When you step over that mark, then of course you'll get a penalty. I just fear that we're perhaps overcomplicating it, and all I would do is encourage that there is a constructive discussion between the drivers and the drivers' stewards to say, okay, we're going to have another 4 hotly contested races, and we need to see what is and what isn't acceptable. It's frustrating that you don't want to have to consult a rulebook on every single overtake or defense, and all of these guys have grown up doing a lot of racing and understand the principles of that. And I think it's just important that we don't over-regulate to a point where you encourage a behavior that's not within the guidelines in the principles of motor racing." However, while Verstappen was able to get away in Austin because he respected the sacred rule of being ahead at the apex of the corner and therefore having every right to defend it, the Turn 4 incident with Norris in Mexico was definitely out of bounds, and there's no question that penalties like that should be applied more frequently than not. What we're being afraid of is the fact that Verstappen could indeed do this on purpose to try and take away points from Norris, because as all things stand, the Brit now has to outperform Verstappen by 12 points in the remainder of the season if he wants to be a champion by thin margin, which again would haunt the Woking-based squad in terms of how much they've missed in races like Silverstone, Canada, Hungary and Monza. On the other hand, there is one man who believes that the penalties in Mexico would change the way Verstappen and other drivers approach the races from now on, because the drivers' meeting had pressurized the FIA to apply these changes in dishing out penalties from Interlagos onwards and not wait until 2025. Wolff, the team principal of Mercedes, is adamant that Verstappen will definitely follow the new rulebook, and regardless of who's racing him, he will approach it with a lot more caution because he knows what's at stake, and that 47 points, while seeming too much, can be overruled easily if some of his hard racing ends up with a DNF for him, which he cannot risk. Furthermore, Wolff said, "A driver will always push to the limits, and when the rules or the interpretation of the rules allows a certain way of racing, a driver like Max is always going to exploit it." Now, there's been a new interpretation and execution of those regulations, and I think it will change the way everyone races in the future, and you won't see that anymore. I think the stewards today decided that they don't want to see drivers pushing each other off the track. That will now be the new normality. All drivers will be very aware that if you do that, you risk a 5 or 10-second penalty. I think back in the day, certain stewards had their opinion, and because it wasn't penalized, it basically legitimated it. Fair enough to have a driver who drives within the regulations and utilizes all the margins that are given to them by stewards. This is why they would have to deal with the behavior of Verstappen in a unique way, or similar to what Hamilton had to do back in 2021, as well as Leclerc in the early stages of 2022 when the SF23 was competitive enough to fight for wins. Jos Verstappen, similar to Horner, believes that just because a pair of stewards do not like his son doesn't mean that he will change the way he races. That's just the way he is, and if you can find a way to beat him around that, then you're more than free to do so. Adding further to this extent, the father of the 3-time world champion said, "The FIA should take a good look at the composition of the stewards, of whom is appointed there and whether there are conflicts of interest. For example, former drivers who are more sympathetic to certain drivers or teams. You can speculate about it for a long time, but at the end it makes no difference. Max drives the way he wants anyway. He has to, because the car is just not good enough for now. He's doing everything he can to win the title, and he's really not going to change his driving style just because there are a few stewards who don't like him." But in the latest meeting that the drivers had regarding the driving style of certain drivers, implying to Verstappen, Russell said that 19 out of the 20 drivers agreed that there needs to be a change in how they will approach the next couple of races and the entirety of the 2025 season. Obviously, it's going to be very hard to do so because Verstappen knew he overtook off the track in Mexico and still refused to give the position just to help Ferrari get away at the front. And this is the attitude of a 3-time world champion we're talking about. So giving a position back is not something he's going to do just like that, even though he has no right to keep it whatsoever. But again, Herbert has been adamant that such racing won't be tolerated in the future, and when talking about it to a greater extent, the steward that will be present in Brazil as well went on to say, "The penalties in Mexico weren't harsh. It's the guidelines we followed. The teams agreed with our decisions. The right decisions was made. The 20-second penalty for Verstappen was not harsh. Was Verstappen's driving style on the edge or over the top? Yes, it was. Verstappen's driving style was harsh, especially when he was taking a fellow driver off the track. It's an absolute no-no from me, current drivers, former drivers, and stewards. When Verstappen goes into this horrible mindset of trying to gain an advantage by taking a fellow driver off the racetrack so Ferrari can get the 1-2, that is where he needs to know he doesn't have to do that. Just win in the cleanest way possible you can." With all of this in mind, do you think that the 3-time world champion will change his way of driving? And more importantly, if he doesn't, which is the general belief of the majority of the Formula One world? Do you think that the FIA would have to be a lot stricter when it comes to handling the situation with Verstappen? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in the latest changes that are applied for the Interlagos Grand Prix that are going way against Verstappen's driving style, make sure to click on the video that's appearing on your screen right now.